Good morning. I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, and that's the subject of leadership. It's something that we do every day in our lives. We do it as a parent, we do it as a teacher, we do it as a business executive, we do it in pretty much everything we do. At some point, at some time, we're acting as a leader. And in the 50-odd years I've been in the business world, I've been as a military officer, and as I've been a consultant and an entrepreneur, and whatever role I've been in, coach, parent, whatever, I've found lots of people who are leaders or suggest that they're leaders, but some are really good, some are not so good. In fact, to use a consulting world, they need some coaching. And then I've also found and learned the hard way that leaders are not born, most of us are made. Now, I learned leadership as a young junior officer, but actually really started when I was a Boy Scout. And then it kind of grew. And as a leader, I find that a lot of people don't misunderstand or don't understand the difference between leadership and management. Management's all about managing tasks, grouping them in some kind of sequence to achieve some kind of goal that's set forth. So it's really grouping and sequencing a task. Leadership is about people. It's about motivating people. Those who you work with, sometimes they're superior, sometimes they're subordinates, sometimes they're peers. It's about solving problems. It's about it's about finding ways to get people to do things sometimes that they don't want to do. And when you look at it, the real difference can be summarized in a simple sentence. You lead people and you manage tasks. So in this role as a leader, you're going to run across 4 different kinds of people. Now, you can read all textbooks you want. You can read about type A personalities, people who like to listen, people who like to read, whatever the way they get information. But at the end of the day, in my 70-odd years in this earth, there's really 4 kinds of people that you're going to run into as a leader. Number one, they're the people who get stuff done. Those are the leaders and the people who follow the leaders. Then there are the people who watch other people get stuff done. And they're kind of the ones that I refer to as the watchstanders or the bystanders. Then there are people who don't have a clue that stuff is getting done around them. Those people are, to use the common expression, clueless. And then there's the last category. Those are the people who get in the way of getting stuff done. And those, as a leader, are your biggest challenge. Because most times you can bring the people on who are clueless, you can bring on the bystanders and make a determination whether they're going to add value or whether they just have to be left on the side. But the people who get in the way, you have to either neutralize, you have to bring on board, or you have to ignore. And that's a problem for a leader. And you have to remember, as a leader, one of my favorite sayings best describes the position. It's simply this: what you do speaks so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. So in the context of bringing the people along, you have to be accountable for what you do. And when you're in a subordinate position and somebody walks up to you and taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, I'm going to promote you," your role and your relationship with all those people that you are working with, all your coworkers, instantly changes the moment you take on a mantle of leadership. Whether it's a supervisor, whether it's a manager, whether it's a military officer, whatever it is, your role when you change positions and go up the food chain significantly changes. And it changes more the higher you get. So if you go from a supervisor to a manager, it changes. If you go from a manager to a director, it changes. If you go from a director to a vice president, it changes even more. And it changes even more when you become a senior executive or CEO or something in a position like that. So what you find as you move up the food chain is that leadership is a lonely place. You don't have any friends anymore because the people who you used to work with at your level, your relationship has changed because now you're theoretically your boss. Maybe you moved over to another department, but you've moved up a level and they're still there. So what you have is you have peers. Those are the people at your level in the organization. You have subordinates. Those are the people who are working for you. And you have superiors. And guess what? As a leader, you have to figure out how to work with them, how to motivate them, how to get them to come around to your ideas. So what I'm going to share with you are 8 tenets. I call them tenets. You can call them simple phrases, whatever words you want to use, that will help make you a much more effective leader. Now, the first one is really simple. It's praise in public, chastise in private. Now, how often have you walked into or been sitting in a room or a conference room with 6 or 7 or maybe a dozen of your peers, and the boss walks in and proceeds to chew on somebody's butt? If this is a naval audience or a military audience, I use different terms, but the chewing out happens, and you sitting there become very uncomfortable. 2 things have happened besides your discomfort. One, the person who is being chewed on is embarrassed. And 2, more importantly, the leader has lost credibility. Because by chastising in public, he basically embarrasses himself as well as his subordinate. How often, here's another situation. If you're a sports fan and you listen to sports talk radio as I do, you hear all the time, so-and-so needs to get in the other guy's grill and show some leadership and scream at him. Huh? What you really ought to do in the chastise part of this is that you need to pull the person aside, go into a private setting, and ask them 3 simple questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And how are you going to prevent it from happening in the future? And if they start blaming people, you cut it off. Then you know it's spin. But if they truly will answer the questions, and if you as a leader have trained them to answer questions like this, then you're going to get a pretty good response. And then you as a leader, you can determine whether you're going to chew on their butt. You're going to say, okay, fine, let's move on. We've learned from it, and go on. The second half of this, praise in public, is really simple. You walk into a meeting room, again, you have the same 6 or 7 people, and the leader says, hey, before we get started, I want to talk about so-and-so, and he gives them all kinds of kudos. What happens at that point is the leader's stature increases. More importantly, the person who's being praised becomes what I refer to as a disciple. So if that person was, for example, one of the clueless of the bystanders, you've made a friend. If it was one of the people that were getting in the way of getting stuff done, you've again begun to move them more towards your side. So praise in public, chastise in private. The next 2, or the next one and the one following that, are very closely related. It's simply, the first one is bad news doesn't get better with age. Now, it's not like wine that ages, but how often, if you're a parent, you had a child do something and you find out about it 1 week or 2 weeks later, like there's a dent in the car, or something happened excuse me, at a neighbor's house. What really, as a parent and as the children's leader, what really irritates you not so much as what happened, is the fact that you didn't know about it. They didn't tell you about it. And then the same is true in the business world. Tylenol has gone through several, and these are public stories, so I'm not telling anything out of school, but Tylenol went through several episodes where their drugs were compromised by various things. One was they wound up with some metal in them. Another time they had people poking holes in the thing and inserting cyanide. And each time Tylenol came out, immediately said, hey, we got a problem, pulled everything off the shelves, and said, this is what we're doing to fix it. And the world said, great. And Tylenol still is a popular over-the-counter drug. The second one, after bad news doesn't get better with age, is don't shoot messengers. How often have you been afraid to go to your boss and tell him something was bad? I was a partner in a consulting firm, and I had a very large client in Connecticut. I can't use the name of the client, but I'll tell you a little bit about them. They were a large insurance company, and the project was about building a business case to look at outsourcing almost 1,000 people in their application development and maintenance organization. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call. It's the head of the public relations group. He's the vice president of public relations, and he's calling me. He said, hey, Mark, I just got off the phone with a writer at the Hartford Courant, that's a big state newspaper, and he's writing a story about we're going to get rid of 1,000 people and they're all going offshore, and he had most of his facts wrong. What do I do? And I said, well, look, I said, number one, I'm only a consultant, but you need to tell your boss and the CFO and the CEO. And he said, well, I can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Well, the answer really, as I turned out in the conversation, he was afraid because he would get fired for bringing these people bad news. The company had a history of, quote, shooting messengers. And the bad news about this analogy is simply this. As a leader, you want people from deep within the organization to bring you stuff, bring you information. It's the only way, or one of the only ways, that you can learn about what's really going on in the organization, whether it's a small team, a large corporation, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is you want people to come to you with information. Then you, as a leader, can evaluate it. And the whole trick about this is by not shooting the messenger is it encourages people. And again, I go back to my three things. What happened? Why did it happen? And how are we going to fix it? They don't have to bring you the solution, but at least they have some firsthand knowledge of what happened, and you can begin to work out what went wrong. The fourth tenet about this, the first group of these phrases, which is all about communications with people, is that leaders listen and speak last. Now, if you're in a meeting and you're in a leadership role, what you should do, at least what I've learned to do the hard way, and I say the hard way because I've made this mistake before, is I listen to everybody around the room. I literally go around the table. And again, I've coached them on how to give me their ideas in what simply is what I call a business case format. You know, what are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? And what's the benefit? Then when they give me that, I can then take my own ideas, mesh them with theirs, and then come forth what I think we should do. Because again, as a leader, what are you doing? You're setting the strategy and the business goals, and you want to get the team organized and aligned with those goals. And if you take their input, the people are much more likely to agree with you and work hard for it. One of the big things that I learned when I left the Navy and went into the business world is in the Navy, when you're talking about mission accomplishment or a project, you know that everybody in the room is willing literally to give up their life to achieve the goal. In the business world, it's a little different. If you had 10 people in the room, you know have at least 12 or 15 different agendas, and you got to get them aligned. So the reason about taking their counsel is to help get this alignment. And let me give you a simple example. I was at EDS. I was in the business development world, and we were chasing a very large client in the aerospace world, and it was about a $160 million contract. At least that's what we thought it would be. It actually turned out to be somewhat larger. And I was sitting there, and we were struggling with how can we differentiate ourselves from our peers. Our peers, in this case, or competitors, were CSC and IBM, and we knew pretty much they were all going to do the things the same way. And the technical lead raises his hand as I was going around the table and said, look, I got a pretty good idea. We've got a warehouse of Sun computers that we used at General Motors. They are, in fact, on our books at zero value. We can modify these things, add a board, update the software, blah, 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 and offer them to them whatever price we want because their cost to us is zero. And I said, well, they're used. He said, yeah, so. And so that led to a changing of the pitch or the presentation, the proposal to the client. As it turns out, it made about a $20 million over the 5-year life of the contract difference, and it was a significant differentiator enough so we actually won. And I'll talk more about this particular situation in a little bit later. But the whole idea here was, had I not listened, and had the business guy not listened, we would not have come up with this idea, because I had no clue that we had a warehouse full of used Sun computers. So those are the ones about communication. Bad news doesn't get better with age. Praise in public, chastise in private. Don't shoot messengers. Listen and speak last. So let's talk a little bit about 4 that have to do with the way you work. And the first thing is that in a leadership role, you have to either lead or you have to follow. You cannot do both in the same scenario. Because if you're a leader, when you start saying things or doing things, everybody's going to start questioning, what role is he playing or she playing? Is he being a leader or is he being a follower? And it creates confusion in the organization. So you have to learn how to make a determination going into this, am I going to lead or am I going to follow? Simple example. I was a junior officer in the Navy. I was a detachment officer in charge of a helicopter detachment. We had 1 helicopter, 2 pilots, of which I was one, and 12 enlisted, and we had a bum engine. We had to change it on the back of a small ship. We only had the 14 of us. So In that case, we need to literally manually lift the engine into place. It weighs about 300 pounds. And guess what? I had a strong back. And that's about the only value I could do. So in that role, everybody knew I was a follower. I was being told, hand a wrench, lift this, give that, whatever. So that's the following role. They all knew that I was a detachment officer in charge. But in that particular scenario, it was okay for me to be a follower. So you have to pick and choose when you want to be a follower and when you have to be a leader. But if you are in a leadership role, it is very difficult to give up that role because it will create confusion in the eyes of your subordinates. The next one is know the difference between earned respect and positional respect. Now, positional respect comes from the title on your business card, comes from the rank on your collar, it comes from your position in life. It's whatever it is. You have it no matter, and there's nothing you can do, good, bad, or indifferent. It just exists. It's positional respect. So if you're a manager, you have to respect a director. If you're a director, you have to respect a vice president, et cetera, et cetera. Earned respect comes from something else. It comes from what you do and how well you've done it. So if you go into life looking at doing everything with excellence, then you generally create earned respect. Again, a simple example. When I had just made partner at this small consulting firm. At the time, we had about 60 people. We ultimately wound up with about 500 people when I left. And the reason I was made partner was not because of my outstanding consulting skills, which were not very outstanding. It was because I was really good at finding clients, closing the deal, and extending the relationship. Okay? So when I would sit down with the guys who had been there for a while, I had skins on the wall that they didn't have, and I didn't have nearly the consulting experience. I didn't come from the pedigree of KPMG or one of the big consulting firms like E&Y and Anderson before it went belly up, and some of those firms. I was a naval officer who had been a CEO of a small business. I worked for EDS, and I didn't know diddly squat about consulting. But 2 years into my tenure, I had a lot of skins on the wall. So that gave me earned respect. And so that when I spoke or I made recommendations or suggestions, people listened. The third one about the way you work is don't ask people to do what you can't do or won't do. How often have you walked in a situation, the leader is sitting there giving this direction and that direction, and you know full well he either has no clue on how to do it, or B, has never done it before, or more importantly, is unwilling to do it. Now, there's variations in this. I can't say that. I'm not saying that if you're a mechanic and or you're not a mechanic and you tell somebody to go change an engine, that they expect you to do that. But they expect you to understand why the engine has to be changed and come up with some kind of reasonable rationale as to why it should be done.